So, you have a 3D render, but something is missing. You can't really put your finger on it, but it doesn't have the proper feel, that last fine touch, making your whole scene, color and lighting just work. Well, it may very well be that you haven't incorporated some simple cinematic rules that can really push your renders to the next level. And that is exactly what we will be focusing on in this video. Hello everybody, Martin here for cgboost.com and welcome to this new video where I will share with you some of the cinematic tips that I've gathered throughout my career and that I use pretty much every time I make 3D artwork or renders. These cinematic tips are closely connected to the general design and composition rules. We of course won't miss the all-important rule of thirds. We will discuss various types of lighting, how different placement of camera changes the psychological effect on the audience, and also some Eevee rendering tips. One note guys, this is not a step-by-step guide, rather a breakdown video. So if you're not sure about Blender, definitely sign up for Zach's free Blender resources bundle, including a Blender's beginner's course and a comprehensive shortcut PDF. These materials will get you started in Blender in no time. I know, I've tried it myself. But with that said, I think it's time to have a look at these 10 cinematic tips that will definitely help you with your 3D renders. The first thing you'll probably notice when you open this scene is that I've tried to make it as simple as possible. Just basic shapes, a few extrudes and bevels, nothing fancy. That goes to the characters as well. These in fact I downloaded from the awesome online rigging tool called Mixamo. You can by the way learn all about this topic on my own specialized channel, link is in the description. Right off the bat you can see we have 3 characters, some mysterious figure here on the left, and by the looks of it, it is probably hiding from these 2 guys on the right. I actually imagine this to be some sort of dystopian future where everybody is forced to stay at home, quarantined, while police forces control the streets. Wait. So, you can see I have just a few shaders here, no textures and no fancy effects. The whole scene is simple on purpose though. What I wanted to do was to create a cinematic looking final result using just camera work, composition, lighting setup, some atmosphere and a few Eevee tricks. This way I believe you will be better able to apply these concepts to your own artwork without relying simply on your modeling, shading and texture work. Alright, but now let's jump into the first step I usually do when creating my scenes, the basic camera and composition. When placing a camera in your scene, the first thing you want to think about is the story. Story? Well, what if my render is just a regular environment or architectural render and it has no story, you may ask. Well, in my opinion, that's wrong. Even without characters, you can, and you should, make your image tell some sort of narrative. Give some background information through various choices you make, not only when creating the scene, but also by placing camera and lights. This way, your image will be always much more relatable and exciting. First off, it's good to ask yourself, what is the main focus of the image, and what is it that you want to express through it? If I have a building as my focus, do I want it to feel pleasing, inviting, dark, obscure, colossal? In short, what sort of emotion do I want to achieve? You can ask the same thing when it comes to nature environments, scenes with characters, even hard surface and car renders. Every time you will be deciding on how you want the most important aspect of your image to feel. Unless you do some boring shot with no story and emotions, which I don't even know why you would do such a thing. Anyway, here, from the pose of our main character, we can clearly guess she probably doesn't want to be seen. On the other hand, while these characters seem relaxed and unconcerned, in their hands they hold something resembling a weapon and a baton. So yeah, these are probably not some guys you would want to meet alone at night, police or not. Well, this all gives me a lot of useful information for how to create this shot. I know that it should be mysterious, so I will go for something dark, situated at night. I'll want the whole composition to somehow tilt towards these guys, while also focusing on our main character. When it comes to camera placement, there is nothing easier than to quickly create a camera and start playing around with it. You simply hit Shift A, add a camera, and when you hit numpad 0, you will be transported into it. If you want, you can hit Home key to make your camera view fill the viewport. To manipulate with your camera from this view, you can hit Shift and tilde key, which is right underneath your Escape key. And if that doesn't work for you, you will find the command in the View menu, Navigation, and here. Now you are in the walk navigation mode and you can move around the scene as you would in any first-person shooter game. You know, like in Counter-Strike, if you've ever played it. Using the WASD keys, you can fly forward, backward, or to the sides, while Q allows you to fly down and E up. If you scroll your mouse wheel, you can make this movement slower or faster. Well, you probably know all this from Zach's Blender Launchpad course, right? Okay now, so where should we place our camera? Given what we've said, that this scene should be somewhat mysterious, there are a few ways we can achieve that. First off, I want to see both the main character and the policeman in the background, as well as the street and probably the back building over here. This in itself already limits the camera angle quite a bit, so go to the camera and fly to that position. Now a big topic is always at what height should you place your camera. So-called high-angle shots, looking down on the ground, are usually, and logically, good for some sort of scene overview. When it comes to characters, if you want to achieve a feeling that your main character is somewhat superior than the other in your scene, you usually place your camera slightly higher, looking down on the others, like in these movie examples here. In our case though, this is quite the opposite. I think to achieve the slightly uneasy feeling I'm after, I will go with a low angle shot, placing it below my characters, almost to the street level, looking up. For example, something like this. You can even fly around and try to render different compositions, and using this render engine workbench, it doesn't take too long to render each of them. Don't forget to use different slots to not lose your previous renders though. Now, can you feel it? Being this low, it already gives an impression like you looking through the camera are somewhat smaller than the scene and everybody in it, feeling the weight of the shot bearing down on you, or at least compared to this, right? The composition is still a bit boring though, so let's try to improve it, shall we? One thing we can do to make the whole image more cinematic is to play around with the so-called aspect ratio of the shot in this output menu. This terminology in fact goes back all the way to the good old days when movies were shot on a film material called celluloid and everything just seemed a bit more real and gritty. This aspect ratio comes from a time when all of the camera's operating systems for the celluloid film were more or less square, or rather 4:3 ratio. But films actually started using widescreen panoramic format. What they did to be able to record this widescreen format on a square film material is that they used something called anamorphic format. It was made so that the recorded film images in the camera were squashed horizontally, and then, when they reprojected in cinema, they stretched it to its intended shape. Hence, you can see here on Wiki, for example, there are some basic filmic formats which you can try out yourself. Just make your resolution square, 1080 to 1080 for example, and then add this 185 to 1 aspect ratio, which is somewhat of an older film standard ratio, US widescreen standard. When you now render everything, you can see it's all squashed like this, and later in the post-production you would have to stretch it to look normal. But all this said and done, this is just a curiosity and it's pretty much useless for our purposes. I usually don't change the aspect ratio at all unless I need to work specifically with some video files made with various filmic formats. Otherwise, in case of digital images, I just put in this 2560 resolution here in the width, and you effectively get almost a 21:9 aspect ratio, which, at least to me, always makes things more epic. In connection with that, you've probably heard about a certain universal principle called rule of thirds or golden ratio. In general, it tells you that if you divide your image by two equally spaced horizontal and vertical lines, all the really important stuff should be placed along their intersections. That's when, in most cases, things start to work out and feel good. Luckily, instead of you having to draw these, camera settings in Blender give you a rather carefully hidden option right here to activate a wide variety of these compositional guides. Here you have the classical center line, good for example when you're making some graphical elements, or one-point perspective, which is centered, and then some diagonals, and also the mentioned rule of thirds and a slightly different golden ratio. Two things I will say. I believe that none of these rules should be adhered to dogmatically, and also that everyone's preference for how exactly to follow these rules is a bit different. Me, for example, I usually drift slightly more towards the edges of my composition. In any case, I recommend learn more about the composition rules, but then don't forget to follow what your gut tells you as well. For my scene here, I will actually use this very cool variation of the composition lines, which is this golden triangle. It adds some nice diagonal lines, and since I plan on tilting my image a bit later, I know I will find some use for this. Basically, what I want to achieve is having the important stuff around these two regions over here. So let's take the camera and move it somewhat better now. For example, like this. Another very useful tool for achieving various psychological effects through your camera work is focal length. Again, it is something that originates from how actual cameras work. Every camera has a lens, or a device through which the light goes into the camera, and then an image sensor, something onto which the light is projected and where the image is captured. The distance between these 2 points drives the way the light is projected onto the sensor, and thus how wide your camera perspective gets. And thanks to modern technologies, like Blender, I can show this to you right now, digitally. See the camera here. So this is our lens, and this point in the center is the image sensor. Now if you just grab this and move it, you can see our final image changing size, the whole composition stretches or contracts, and also, what you can see, the perspective grid gets distorted in these extremely wide cases. Okay, so that's all well and good, but what does it mean practically? Let's have a look at the normal settings first, which is around 40 to 50 mm lens, since that is roughly how our eye perceives the world. By the way, you can change the lens settings here in the properties to get more precise numbers. This normal lens will give you the most relatable results. You won't introduce much distortion, and things will feel just normal, which is good if you don't aim at anything dramatic. Which we are, in fact. So let's try a long lens, that is usually anything from 60 mm to 120, 210, and sometimes even more, like much more. And what it does, you can see for yourself. It basically squashes your perspective, making things look closer. The perception of the depth is contracted, and details in the scene come out. Thus, this is good for focusing on a specific point in your composition, making it more important. However, we want to do the opposite, focus on the whole scene with its various elements. So we will instead go lower with the focal length to about 30 mm. You can see the image expanding, showing more of the environment, and also introducing the slight perspective bending, not too noticeable at 30 mm, but already there a bit. This way, we achieve a bit more unusual feel to the composition, making it slightly unsettling, which is what we want for this image. To add to that feeling, there is also another tool that I like to use, this time a bit simpler one. It is camera tilt. So far, we have this horizontal positioning of our camera quite straight, which is good for more relaxed compositions. However, to increase the feeling of something wrong, you can take your camera and rotate it slightly on the y-axis, introducing this slight angle. And you have to choose where you want it to be leaning towards. In our case, I want to tilt the attention of the eye towards these guys. Can you feel how the composition got a bit more ominous with this little detail? You don't want to overdo it though, and an angle of 2 or 4 is usually quite enough. Now, a very useful trick you can use is to flip your composition. This is one thing I learned from some of my concept art attempts. Concept artists love to do this regularly to give them fresh perspective on their image and how good the composition works for them. To do this trick quickly, I love to select the camera and then use this shortcut, S to scale it, X twice to lock the horizontal scaling to local axis, and then -1 on your numpad. This way you flip your image just like you would in Photoshop. Other option is to render your image again. Open up our compositing editor, and in between this image node and the composite, you can put this flip node. This way you can check and recheck your flip composition and see the result. What you want to look for is whether your composition isn't lacking in the flip view. Oftentimes your eyes will restart and start noticing something that you didn't see until you flipped the image. You should check whether the image isn't tilting too much, which often happens when you rotate your camera like we did. In our case though, this seems quite fine as it is. And I think with this, we are ready with our composition. Therefore, let's start a whole new chapter, the lighting. Lighting is of course a whole new type of beast, and it would take a whole course to even scratch the surface of this complex discipline. Let me, however, give you a very quick and practical overview of how I approached lighting this scene. At this stage, having a concept art of course helps. However, since we have such a simple real-time scene here, it actually is often much faster to just add some lights and play around until you're happy with it. First off, though, I started actually with thinking about what I want to achieve with this scene. So, mysterious, yes, we said it like a million times already. Usually, just having a moonlight in the scene helps with that. So, I decided to have my moonlight as my first light source, probably coming from up here. I wanted some contrast in the lighting, so for the bluish dark silhouettes of the policemen, I wanted them to be lit by a warm street lamp light and possibly even a window light. I did not want to go all out dark, mysterious and evil on them with red or green lights. I mean, who would really put green or red light into their home, right? So I figured just a regular orange tones would be okay. On the other hand, I did want to add some mysteriousness to the red hero character here, so that's why I decided to have slightly cooler, less intense lighting for it. Something bluish or magenta-ish? Magenta. There are generally 3 types of lights, depending on the intensity and where it comes from. Key light, which usually is the most prominent light in the scene, usually lights the character from a slight angle from the front. Backlight adds nice silhouette to it, helping the eye to distinguish between the object and its background. And finally, fill light fills the nasty dark regions between the 2 main lights. So with that in mind, I started lighting this thing. Let me now switch to my lighted scene and let's dissect it properly. You may wonder why everything turned so very dark. That's because I switched to the render preview mode of the Eevee renderer, and also I made this surface of the world much darker, almost all the way to black. Oh, and by the way, let me mention again, you can download these blend files from the Blender Resources course. Just sign up for it and follow along with the lighting process. It usually helps to start with the brightest, most important, and also most natural light in your scene, which in our case is the moon. So I decided to quickly add the cylinder all the way back here, add an emission shader to it, make it brighter, and to it I added a sun lamp. Back in our camera view, you can clearly see how much of a difference this made immediately. I played around with the intensity of the light and gave it a very slight bluish tone since it's a moon. With that done, I moved to the other most prominent light source, which was this window. Here, I selected these polygons in edit mode and added a new emission shader to them, this time tinted orange, like this. For the actual light source, I added this area light here, made it rectangular, and made it to fit the frame. Immediately, this light gave our policeman more focus. For the main heroine, I chose a spotlight with some soft edges and bigger cone angle. I pointed it here so that it did not illuminate too much of the wall, but mostly the character. Then, this color, which is something between blue and magenta, ensured it looked more like a neon light rather than another moonlight, which wouldn't make sense to have two moons. Anyway, this was a first step to lighting my characters, but lighting can always be taken a step further, which is what I tried to do, of course. For the environment, I decided to add a bluish spotlight back here to bring out this high rise. Having it shine from below like this implies some sort of bright street light, and also having a light illuminate something big from below always adds some ominousness to it. I decided to add this glowing shader to these polygons on the lamps, and since these are instances, both of the lamps were immediately edited together. And of course, don't forget to add a light to the lamp. An area light will do. I set it up like this, and when I added it up here, it created a nice highlight on the top of the characters' heads, which is another great cinematic lighting tool. If you use this top light in a daylight scenario in combination with other lights, you will achieve a pleasing effect. On the other hand, if you just use this light, it actually makes the result more sinister. Just look at this frame from the movie Godfather, for example. Then I proceeded to add orangey light back here, just to imply there is something going on in the other street as well. It is quite important to make your audience feel like there is actually something going on outside of the screen's frame. Also, this light brought out the car model a bit. By the way, I downloaded this one from BlendSwap from a user called Mr. Han 15, and it's actually an Indonesian police car. So, thanks Mr. Han. That was it for the environment, but I decided to highlight my characters a bit more. For these guys here, I actually decided I will not use fill light. If I did so, they would of course become a bit more visible, and I would get rid of these dark areas. But to keep them tiny bit mysterious, I decided to leave it like this. Instead, I wanted them to stand out from the background a bit more, so some cool backlight would be ideal for that. And this is where we move to a stage where a bit of artistic cheating starts. This sunlight, or rather moonlight, by itself doesn't really make enough of a rim light on these characters. However, when I added a spotlight here, made it in a color of the moon, raised the intensity and restricted its angle to envelop only these characters, I achieved a very nice backlight on them, and also I got this very nice cinematic feel. Then I decided to not have the light go all the way down to the street. You can do that by activating this distance option and restricting it. I love this option in Eevee. Beware though, it doesn't work in cycles, so this might cause some major differences if you decide to switch later. For the main heroine, I added 2 extra lights. One was a new spotlight with a very soft cone and a small angle value, shining only on her face, like there are these rogue light rays reaching all the way towards her from this window, which is nonsense, of course. But it looks nice. As long as your lighting is at least a bit motivated by logical light sources, you can get away with quite a lot actually. Just have a look at movies and see how often they cheat like this too. Finally, I made another spotlight coming from behind her. Again, completely physically incorrect, but you know, there is a slight possibility that it may be coming from this neon light out of the frame. And it adds a nice cool backlight, or rather a rim light, to our main character. Usually, rim light and backlight are interchangeable terms, but the way I personally use it, I rather make it shine from the side or a sharp angle, so that it often illuminates my characters just from one side. And that's it. This is how I was able to light this scene cinematically with just a few lights, following a few simple guidelines. However, we can still do more. Oh, and one little thing I did as well was to select these polygons of the curtains and added a slightly lighter version of the basic shader, just to make it look like it's translucent. Then we can, for example, add a huge cube and make everything invisible. Nope. It was a joke. But the cube part is correct. Scale it so that it starts about here and goes all the way to the building back here, and then make a new material for it. In this case, it will be this principled volume shader. Be sure to plug in the material into the volume rather than surface, and here we go. We have some very nice mysterious fog in our scene. Lower the density significantly, also the color and the anisotropy as well. And whoa, that looks nice, right? Another fast solution to make things awesome is activating this bloom option in the render properties window. You can play around with the settings here. I choose something like this. Pretty good, right? I love it when you light your scene properly and then just use these effects to make everything just a bit more awesome. You can then also experiment with your depth of field values, activating it here and setting up the distance in camera. However, for these wide shots, I don't really like to use it. I rather focus on it when I have, for example, a close-up like this one here. There are, of course, plenty other settings here that can make your Eevee render look better. Like these soft shadows, which may slow down your scene significantly, but they make all of the shadows much more convincing. Also, you can increase the shadow resolution here. Then you can even activate real-time reflections, though in case of this simple scene, it doesn't make much difference since we do not have reflective materials. Oh, and we can also use this ambient occlusion option. I usually like to crank up these two values here, both to 2. Remember, when you are done with everything, or even throughout the whole process, you can actually adjust your environment to fit your composition better. We can, for example, add some simple blanks here, since this spot is a bit empty. And while we're at it, let's actually tilt them so that they play nicely together with our established composition guide. Also, we can fill this spot with some cans and planks as well. And this looks better. Finally, when you're all done and happy with your scene, you can increase these samples here, though in case of Eevee, I found it's not that necessary to go overboard with the samples. Make your render size to 100 and render your image with F12. Then, with it rendered, you can always improve it in a compositing software of your choice. So I choose Blender's Compositor. Here you can add various post-production effects like vignette to add those little edge imperfections that lenses normally have. Let's quickly set it up, add an ellipse mask here, blur node as well in between these two, and plug it into a mix node set to multiply. Then just set up the width and height of the ellipse mask, and in the blur node set this to relative, and about 40% for X and Y is good enough. In the end, you can have a look at the difference between the two versions with and without vignette, and you can control the intensity of the vignette here in this factor value. One more way to make all this more cinematic is to add a film grain to it. Another thing that happens to camera shots you record. They have this very specific noise in them. So for that, I have a noise texture and I've added it to the project files. So you just find it in the description and download it. And then you can import it into Blender Scene and mix it together with the result using the overlay mode, which is the correct one for mixing grain into your shots. Last thing we can do is to add a curves node here and play around with these lines. First, let's go to the blue channel and raise the blue shadows down here. That's something most films have, some nice blues in their dark areas. Also, you can lower the green highlights, but let's actually add one more point here so that really only the highlights are adjusted. With this change, you make the orange region slightly more intense, which tends to be pleasing to the eye, since we as humans simply love skin colors. Finally, let's try to add a bit more contrast. And with that, have a look at the final image. Not bad compared to the original one, I think. Not bad at all. And here we are, my friends. Remember, all these tips are just guidelines and nothing is really set in stone. You will do well not to underestimate them, learn them and relearn them, and of course actively search for them in movies and paintings. Also, these tips that I provided are just scratching the surface of this topic. So definitely do some research, buy books, watch tutorials, and if you want some inspiration in this field, definitely read the description of the video. I will share some books and courses there. But that's it for today. I hope you learned something practical that you will incorporate into your workflows. Stay creative, my friends, and until next time, Martin out.